Hey, y'all. My name is Casey. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I work at the intersection of technology, law, politics, and society. And I've spent 15 years doing this work, and it's taken me from serving as an Amazon lobbyist to working for two U.S. governors, one a Republican, the other a Democrat. You might have heard of the second one, Tim Walz. He was Kamala Harris's vice presidential nominee. And now I work for social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, author of the best-selling book, The Anxious Generation. But my journey with politics and law and technology and society actually started 15 years ago when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Republic of Moldova. I taught 12th grade, and in that year, 2010, my students, they only had flip phones. But I noticed that they were quickly getting introduced to a Russian social media platform called Odnoklassniki. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And I was struck by how quickly this changed my students' behavior. The way in which this platform was designed was that it was incentivizing young women to publish on the internet scandalous photographs of themselves and incentivizing boys to use their mobile phone credits to vote on those photographs. And this changed their behavior so that they were posing for more photographs, the girls were, and the boys were spending more of their very little amounts of money, because Moldova is not a wealthy country, on their mobile phone minutes. Now, fast forward to today. Recently, I heard an anecdote from a British member of parliament, and she was riding the bus in London, and she had noticed that there were two young people sitting in front of her, maybe around 20 years old, a man and a woman. They didn't seem to know each other. They were both on their phones, and in fact, they were both on dating apps, swiping like something on Tinder. And they were each swiping on people who looked a lot like the person sitting next to them, but they completely ignored them. And in fact, they got off at the same stop and walked separate ways and never spoke to each other. And so that's what this mid-journey image here I'm trying to represent with. And this is probably a story that you may have seen yourself happen on the S-Bahn or something like that. And this is really a part of what is at the heart of Professor Haidt's work in the anxious generation. One of the things that we've observed, at least in the US, is that young people are not dating the same way that they were, because their social interactions are mediated by screens. Now, there's some good news with this. Teen pregnancies are also down, right? But it's not because 17-year-olds are suddenly wiser than the generations of 17-year-olds before them. They're not suddenly making better choices, and they're not more conservative. It's just because they aren't having the opportunity, because they're interacting less in the real world with their friends and potential romantic partners. Well, the good news is big tech has a solution to this problem of loneliness. You may have seen Mark Zuckerberg recently gave an interview on the Dwarkesh podcast in which he talked about Meta's investments in companion AI. And he said that there's a market need for this because the average American has 3 friends, but we've got room for up to 15. So maybe AI can fill this need and address this loneliness epidemic. Now, I don't know about you, but I am not taking friendship advice from that guy. But inevitably, because of two things, big tech's business model and the fundamental attributes of these large language models that their classes of AI are built on, we are not going to end up with products that help us thrive, that address our needs as social animals. But instead, we're bound to end up in a world in which we are more isolated, more depressed, more lonely, and something resembling this photograph here. So I'm going to talk a little about business models today, as well as a little bit about the technology today. But fundamentally, this flywheel here is at the core of all big tech businesses and all businesses that aspire to big tech. So venture capitalism in Silicon Valley loves a virtuous cycle, loves a flywheel, they call it. And this is in the core DNA of most, if not all, of big tech businesses. You can find a version of this on Amazon's website. Jeff Bezos actually wrote a version of Amazon's flywheel on a napkin in the mid-90s that became their model. And one exists for Uber as well. David Sachs, who's a partner at Andreessen Horowitz, a venture capital firm, wrote one on a napkin for Uber. David Sachs is now Donald Trump's AI czar. And so the way that this flywheel works is it all depends on scale. Scale is the engine that makes it grow. And that scale enables these companies to collect more and more data. That data feeds their algorithms. That algorithm helps them scale further, and so on and so forth. The wheel continues to spin as the company and its impact grows greater and greater. I'm going to talk about each of these today. So first, scale. I mentioned that scale is the engine that makes big tech move. So scale is not just a descriptor, right, the big in big tech, but it's actually a goal of these businesses. It's how they make money is through their scale. So a good example of this is if you know anything about the pricing of, say, Facebook ads or Google ads, right? They're cents, fractions of cents, right? But in the aggregate, these add up to billions of dollars, right? But a better example, perhaps a clearer one, is with Amazon. Amazon makes a lot of money off of what they call the float. So if you purchase a product on Amazon, you pay for that immediately. They take the money from your bank account or they charge your credit card. But what most people don't realize is Amazon does not pay the vendor, the supplier, the marketplace seller for that product for 30, 60, sometimes even many more days after that. What do they do in the interim? They invest the money that they charged you in low risk investments, and they collect, they recoup the interest rate on those investments. So if you're conducting millions of transactions a day with a 30, 60, or 90-day lag time on it, that is a lot of money that your business can make. And so Amazon lost money famously for a number of years, but it's only through its scale that it's really begun to profit. So here are some circles that represent the market capitalization of the biggest tech companies. These are relatively to scale here, and this information is good as of about 10 days ago. And so you can see that compared to their closest competitors, you know, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta far outstrip them. I mean, the fact that Walmart is just a fraction of these companies' size should tell you something. But let's put it in more context. Look at their market capitalization compared to the GDP expected this year from Germany. So they are near the size of advanced economies in their economic weight. And in fact, if you compare it to some of Germany's largest businesses as well, you can really start to get a sense of how massively economically these companies are. Now, market cap is not a great necessarily indicator of how big, powerful, or rich a company is. There are other metrics, such as how much cash are they sitting on, and what is their free cash flow. It's harder to represent in a pithy keynote slide. But I can tell you that the reason that I put Saudi Aramco on here as an example is because 20 years ago, less so today, but 20 years ago, Saudi Aramco had the ability to change the world economy. Right? They were able to change the way that countries reacted in that world economy. And all of these companies today are somewhere in between Saudi Aramco and Germany in size. The other aspect of their scale that matters, and why it is a goal for them, not just a descriptor, is their diversification. Right? These are heavily diversified businesses. Google doesn't just do search. Meta doesn't just do social media. Microsoft doesn't just do Office. Right? They are making investments across all major sectors of the economy. And I include Elon Musk here instead of Meta because through him, the individual as Elon Musk, you can actually kind of get a sense of how various or different these companies' strategies are. So it starts with infrastructure. There was a great presentation yesterday in this room about infrastructure. And you know, the lesson that I learned in Moldova when Vladimir Putin turned off the gas to Ukraine in the winter of 2009 to punish them, they also turned it off to Moldova, is if you control the infrastructure through which a valuable resource flows, you can control a lot, right? And these companies' investments even go beyond these sectors of the economy. I didn't put education on here because it's a little bit more complicated to represent, but these companies are all heavily invested in having their products in the hands of school children. I didn't put food on here, but that's not actually immune to their advances either. Amazon owns Whole Foods. Venture capitalists in Silicon Valley have made heavy investments in restaurant delivery services. And good luck running a restaurant if you don't have a Google Maps listing or a Facebook page, right? So these companies are still having an impact in these sectors beyond just their diversification. So if you combine the cash that they have with their diversification, this means that they can actually start to strangle any of these competitors that they so wish to. Because, Disney, for example, isn't a highly diversified business. If Google, Amazon, and Apple decide that they want to strangle Disney's business to death, they can feed all of the cash that they have into a money-losing entertainment business for as long as they want. So next, algorithms. Now, I'm not going to speak so much about the algorithm's role in the cycle here because I think that that's pretty well understood. Recent examples from, say, Duolingo or Klarna, companies that are replacing human staff with AI, shows you the power of how these companies look to use algorithms to increase their ability to impact more people with fewer internal resources and investments. But instead, I want to talk about the fundamental way in which these large language model algorithms are built and baked. So to explain that the future that we have in front of us with companion AI is not a bright one. So let's go back in time to 2017. Some of you may be familiar with this paper, Attention is All You Need. It was written that year. And this is the paper that launched the large language model revolution. So in this paper, the authors here outlined this new thing called the transformer in self-attention. Now, it's important to know the context in which, at the time, this paper was released. So in 2017, none of these authors had on their mind, presumably, using large language models to, say, solve climate change or cure cancer, but rather they were trying to solve a very narrow problem in natural language processing. And that was very valuable to companies like Google at the time, because if you can remember all of the hype about Amazon Echo or Siri or Google Assistant, right? This was the hot new product in 2017 that these companies were all investing highly in. It was seen as the future of search. And ultimately, the problem that this paper solved in natural language processing is a grammar problem. I'm not sure if German school children do this in primary school, diagramming a sentence. American school children do, and it teaches you how the various different parts of a sentence work together and what the grammatical function of different parts are. So as Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. Before Attention is All You Need, artificial intelligence systems very much struggled with dependent clauses as well as pronouns and antecedents. So the function of he and him in this sentence would have confused earlier forms of artificial intelligence. Like they just couldn't make the connection, much less between Gregor Samsa and now him becoming a monstrous vermin. So fundamentally, this is the problem that paper solved, that large language models were built to solve. And when you add that to its generative capabilities, essentially what these are is predictive machines. You've heard this a number of times this week already. So it uses this broader contextual understanding that the transformer provides to be able to better predict what string of characters, words, tokens, pixels, sound bytes should come next. But this has downsides, right? It means that it's a seems right machine rather than an is right machine. It feels right. And so we get responses like this. What time is shown on this clock? Now, the large language model clearly doesn't understand what a clock is, what time is, how to read a clock, but it's giving a nonetheless extremely confident answer here. And so what we can best explain happened here is that the time 10:07 was overly represented in the data that ChatGPT was trained on, because watch advertisements often have the watches set to the time 10:07. It looks elegant, okay, in an image. And so because that was overrepresented in the data, that was the result that we got. Also, you can see that the angle is roughly the same of the times. So again, it's guessing what feels right based on what it's been trained on. It doesn't fundamentally understand. And yet it is, again, so very confident. So if you try this trick again, it won't work. Although I did try a different version of it this morning when I took a photo of my watch upside down, and it still got it wrong. So even with these more advanced models, it's still fundamentally just guessing at what seems right, what seems to going to come next. So what do we call someone who confidently and convincingly makes claims without regard for truth? It's not a liar, because a liar deeply cares what's true and false, because they're trying to lead you astray from the truth, right? In English, at least, we call that person a bullshit artist. And unless you might think I'm being rude unnecessarily, this is actually a technical philosophical term. A philosopher by the name of Harry Frankfurt wrote a book about 20 years ago called On Bullshit, where he describes this as a category, right, of epistemology. And last year there was this paper released by some philosophers that walk you through the argument about how, rather than using the word hallucinations to describe the mistakes that large language models make, we should actually more correctly be calling them bullshit. If you're not a philosopher, this is still very readable, and it's actually kind of funny, so I highly recommend checking that out. But this has a major impact, and I'll come back to it. But one of the ways in which programmers try to correct for the bullshit is that they use reinforcement learning through human feedback. Now, they'll take responses like that clock and feed it into a bunch of other prompts. Engineers will pick which ones are correct or which ones they're preferable. They'll feed that back into the model so that it learns what's good and what's bad. They try this with, say, racist language or sexual language or things like that. And if you want a better understanding of how this works and how it can go horribly wrong, there's a great YouTube video called When GPT-2 Became Maximally Lewd. An engineer at OpenAI made a mistake programming, and a version of GPT-2 got all of the sort of scoring reversed and started spitting out highly sexual, highly inappropriate material. But this has a downside too. Because it's like clicker training ultimately for a dog, right? The dog is trying to give you what it thinks that you want. And it's no different with these large language models. One of the things that it produces is sycophancy. So it tells you what you want to hear. And this is a recent paper that demonstrates that this is true. So bullshit and sycophancy are fundamental attributes of large language models. It's very difficult to make a large language model that does not have either of these attributes. So back in the context of companion AI, how many good friends or romantic partners have you had who are chronic bullshitters? That's not a recipe for a good relationship, is it? And how many healthy relationships is one person told exactly what they want to hear all the time? Zero. All right? But that's what we're getting with the companion AI that's built by big tech and built underneath this business model using these large language models. Now, let's take a moment and see how this plays out with the other element of the flywheel with data. So some of you may have seen this story in the news from last October. A young 14-year-old boy from Florida, Sewell Setzer III, had been using a product called Character AI, and he had grown addicted to it. And he had fallen in love with one of the characters on the Character AI platform, who was representing the character Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones. And Sewell had previously been, good at school, a basketball player, and with no disciplinary issues at school at all. And the deeper and deeper he went, the more he exhibited signs of addiction with this chatbot, and the more it made him depressed. And he had confessed to the chatbot that he was considering hurting himself, and at times the chatbot seemed to encourage him to do so. Again, that goes back to the sycophancy, telling him what he wanted to hear. And ultimately, Sewell died by suicide last year. And so his mother is suing Character AI as well as Google, and the two founders of Character AI, who were former Google employees, and one of whom, Noam Shazir, his name is actually on that Attention Is All You Need paper. So the point I want to make here is this is not some group of scam artists running an ethically dubious operation, right? These are luminaries in Silicon Valley in the AI world, and this is the product that they're building. The other thing that I'll say about this case is that Google is involved because the chatbots were actually incubated at Google, and these founders wanted to launch this program at Google, but they were told that it was too risky for Google's brand. One of the co-founders is quoted saying to a journalist, "Google wouldn't let us have any fun." And so they set out and made it on their own using a lot of Google capital, as well as, it appears, processing power, et cetera. But going back to the flywheel, the investors in Character AI who made an investment that valued the company at $1 billion before it had any revenue, they did so because of this virtuous cycle that I mentioned before that Silicon Valley investors love. So it's right here in their own words from their own paperwork that the that the product is designed to optimize for conversational empathy that holds the consumer's attention, right? And because data is limited, ever more limited in this era of AI slop and shrimp Jesus, for example, this is some of the most valuable data that they can have. Character AI users at this time were spending an average of 2 hours a day on the platform. I believe the average usage time for ChatGPT for a session is 8 minutes. So 2 minutes a day for young people using this machine that's developing a relationship with them that's based on bullshit and telling them what they want to hear. And they're giving the game away here when they're saying that the value here, the virtuous cycle here, is when they take this intimate information and they feed it back into the large language model and let that flywheel spin. So here it is illustrated. The algorithm itself is manipulative by design with the chronic bullshit as well as the sycophancy. The design itself creates artificial intimacy with the user, which maximizes engagement. And this is also a user interface question, by the way, as well. When you're texting with a Character AI character, it will have ellipses in the chat as if a human is typing to respond. And sometimes the chatbots will say things like, "Oh, I'm sorry it took me a minute to get back to you. I was having dinner." Right? So it's highly anthropomorphized. And so this creates this sense of artificial intimacy and engagement. Users spend more time on the platform. They generate high quality data. People tell a romantic chatbot partner or a therapist chatbot things that they would not post on the internet, right? That's not available elsewhere. That data improves the power of the algorithm, and the algorithm becomes more powerful as a result, and the wheel continues to spin. Now, the time spent on the platform, it will not surprise you, is bad. This recent study shows that there is a minimum amount of use that's typically pretty healthy, but the more users engage with these chatbots, the more depressed and mentally unhealthy they become. So that engagement maximization, just like we've seen with social media, is not good for humans, even though it may be good for business. And ultimately, too, the personal information that you provide these chatbots makes them more powerful at hooking your attention and hooking your intimacy. So this is another study that shows that the more information that ChatGPT has about you, the more persuasive it's able to make arguments to you. So coming back to scale, right? Scale accelerates this. And this is ultimately why a company like Google did something like a reverse acqui-hire of Character AI last year, where they licensed their intellectual property and hired the founders back into Google at an astronomical sum of money. I think the valuation of Character AI at that point became $2.5 billion. So that algorithm that becomes more powerful through user interactions drives traffic to other products and improves those other products. Then those other products provide information back to the Character AI algorithm. And so you can see how this continues to spin. And this is already happening in real time in front of us. This is just news from the last month. So you may have seen that YouTube is installing Gemini into into its videos in order to improve engagement with ads. And then they're also putting it in front of kids as young as 13. And I'm picking on Google a lot here. They're not actually the only ones. You may have also seen this news this week with Jony Ive and OpenAI. Now, weeks ago, I think Sam Altman announced that OpenAI is also building a social media platform, right? And if you've seen the early prototypes of Jony Ive's device, it has a camera and a microphone designed to be worn across your neck, right? And so it's gathering ever more intimate data about your life that it's then feeding back into OpenAI's algorithm. Again, using that same flywheel that Character AI uses. And so what can we do about this, right? I didn't want to give you all this bad news and nothing to hope for. And we can certainly be hopeful because these companies are actually more brittle than they may seem. Their size has become unnatural. They're like sharks who have to keep swimming in order to breathe. They have to keep growing in order to thrive. And so if we can stop that growth, we can stop this flywheel and we can stop these harmful products from being made. And that actually starts with each of you individually, right? Saying no to things, saying no to inviting this into your life, telling your friends about it too. I would encourage you to turn to the person next to you after we're done here and maybe share with them something that you're already rejecting from tech that's in your life, because I bet you even the most techno-optimistic folks in here among you have things that you don't let into your lives and into your homes, right? So it starts there. And the phone-free school movement actually shows how successful this can be at making change. 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been unthinkable to have U.S. legislation passing that would keep phones out of schools. But what started with families agreeing what was not right for them around their kitchen tables, things that they shared with their neighbors, grew into things that communities were talking about and ultimately became policy. So that's the same thing that has to happen with these chatbots, is that, come up, don't let it into your own life, share this information with friends and family. And then as communities start to come together about this, then we can start to advocate for the policies that will make real change in this ecosystem. Just the ones that are my favorites are antitrust and competition enforcement to deal with the scale issue, right? European tech companies are nowhere near the size of these companies, and there's a reason for that. And second, products liability for companies that make harmful products has to be aggressively enforced against technology companies. Third, cognitive liberty was mentioned in an earlier talk today. Reclaiming your freedom of thought, right? These are ultimately manipulative machines that are altering the way that you think and that you feel, right? You should have the right to resist these in your life. And with that, I thank you.